Hi, boys and girls. Did you correctly guess the BFG by Roald Dahl? Then you are absolutely correct. That is the book that we're going to read. Hi, and what you're going to do is get your booklet, that's your notebook that will have every chapter that we're going to read, an activity to do with it. So make sure when you're listening that this is in front of you. We're going to take a look at what it looks like inside. I love this quote. Dreams is full of mystery and magic. Do not try to understand them. By Roald Dahl in The Big Friendly Giant. We're going to take a look at the key ELA standards. You may look at that and say, look how many there are, but we're at the end of the year. And if you jump down to the very last one, you're going to see, I can read and comprehend third grade literature. That is what all these standards are. You can ask and answer questions about a test now. You can describe the characters in a story and how their actions contribute to the sequence of events. You can now determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in the text. You can refer to parts of stories and chapters to describe the different parts and build on earlier sections. You can compare and contrast the themes and settings and plots about the stories that are written by the same author or that have the same characters. So all of these things put together, now at the end of third grade, you can read and comprehend the third grade literature. This story, the BFG, takes place in England. If you look at North America where we live, the United States, across the Atlantic Ocean, you find the continent of Europe. England is part of that. It's also known as the United Kingdom. So I want you to take a minute to get your booklet if you haven't already gotten it, and then look at the first page, chapter 1, The Witching Hour. These are the vocabulary words that I'm going to be reading to you every day, or Miss Batone will, and then you listen for them when we're reading the story. Moonbeam, a ray of moonlight. Dormitory, a large bedroom for a number of people in a school or institution. Hesitated, paused before saying or doing something, especially through uncertainty. So now you should have The Witching Hour, chapter 1 in front of you. Sometimes a strategy is looking at question before we actually read the text. Use the bubble map to make a list of words that describe the setting. Then use the words from the bubble map in complete sentences to describe this chapter. So while I'm reading, I'm really going to slow down when it uses the descriptive words in the chapter. That'll give you the opportunity to write them in the bubble map. And then when you're finished, you're going to write to describe the chapter. So we are ready now to hear chapter 1, The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanted through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right on her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a sliver blade slicing through the room on her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this is what they call the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had a world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed to close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you said you had to go to the lavatory, that was not an acceptable excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see anything without them. She put them on, then slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and leaned out the window to see the world, what it looked like now that the witching hour was upon hand. She listened again. Everywhere it was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was so pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road, she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about it, too. Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly, she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black. It was something tall and black. Something very tall and very black and very thin. So the end of chapter 1. Now is your opportunity to pause the video and then answer the questions using to describe that chapter. All right. Chapter 2. Dim, a light not shining brightly or clearly. Trembling, shake without wanting to, typically because of the excitement or anxiety. Enormous, very large in size, quantity, or extent. So in this chapter, you get to describe the giant in your own words. What do you think a long, thin trumpet is used for? And then draw what you think the giant will look like using the description in the book. So think about when I'm reading now, what will the giant look like? All of the descriptive words that I'm reading, get a picture in your mind. Okay, ready for chapter 2. Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than upstairs window of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see now what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer in the upstairs window of the house in the street. It had actually had to bend down and peer in the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in. Then it would slide to the next house and stop again and peer in, and so on, all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it was much more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person, a giant person perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty, moonlit street. The giant, if that's what it was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long trumpet. The other hand, he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucci's house. The Guccis had a greengrocer shop in the middle of High Street, and the family lived above the shop. The two Gucci children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back and pace and put a suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar. One of those square ones with the screw top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of the long trumpet. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the window, upstairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath and woof, he blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring now straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about him. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse, and tingling all over. Wasn't that good? I just want to keep reading, but I have to let Miss Batone read her part tomorrow. So taking your book, you will now answer the question for chapter 2 in your own words. And draw your picture. And what do you think the trumpet was used for? Be sure to upload these to the dojo so we can see your responses. And I can't wait to hear Miss Batone read the next section. Bye, boys and girls.